Hello, listeners. This is Kat, and welcome back to Put Your Hands Up Podfics. This will be the continuation of Deku and Death. This will be part 46, chapter 46, entitled Keep Your Friends Close. Midoriya scribbled away on his second piece of scratch paper, his pencil moving faster than the tick of the second hand on the clock mounted to the wall above him. Still, he calmed himself with a breath and pushed forward. He'd been studying hard, among other things, for the past few weeks leading up to the final exam of the semester, and despite the mounting stress, he was actually feeling pretty good. He certainly wasn't the first to admit how useful Yaoyorozu's weekly study sessions really were, and Todoroki had been more than accommodating in reviewing what must have been truly the basics of law and history. Yamada was fairly insistent on being involved in his study, trying to give him English tips and tricks, but it ended up being the voice hero's enthusiasm, keeping him motivated, that was most helpful. And even though he knew Aizawa would never admit it aloud, Midoriya noticed how he was stepping in to fight Nezu more often, regardless if it really made a difference in how often Nezu continued to drag them both to Tartarus. All while Gami stood right beside him, catching all his little slip-ups and stumbles, being his extra set of hands, his eyes, and his brain, and never once allowing the weight of his curse to crush him, as it relentlessly tried to. So as he powered through the last little bit of his final exam, pushing through bouts of sudden and spontaneous headaches, he kept them all in his head, their smiles, their words of advice and encouragement, their belief in him. They'd prepared him, but really, they all made sure Midoriya never brought himself down with everything they knew he was going through, and everything else they didn't. And because of all that, he walked into this exam nervous but not afraid. And as he worked his way through, as he approached its end, the ticking of the clock instead became a marker of his thorough efforts rather than any pressed time. His pencil reached the end of the page, and he flipped it over in haste, but he was met with nothing more than a blank backing. He blinked, and then he smiled, turning the packet over to the front again, while sliding his chair out in a graceful, silent glide. If anyone noticed him getting up, they didn't bother to tear their eyes away from their own exams while Midoriya walked up to Aizawa's desk, weaving his way around the desks of his classmates just to make sure he didn't jostle anyone's concentration. Aizawa perked up from his usual sleepy gaze, setting the few exams he had already started to grade off to the side. But even in his mask of nonchalance, a proud smile still leaked from the corners of his lips. All done? Midoriya couldn't stop his own smile as he handed his test over. Yeah, he breathed out. The teacher nodded, taking the packet from him. Go change into your costume, and wait for the rest of the class out on the main field. We'll be starting the test exercise once everyone is finished. He hummed what sounded like confirmation enough, and made his quiet exit from the classroom out in the hall. He barely had any time to close the classroom door, however, as a cold burst of air bombarded him from the side. How do you think you did? Gami frantically swirled around him like an excited puppy. How do you feel? Midoriya moved away from the doorway, further down the hall, glancing back and forth just to make sure no one was in immediate earshot. Then he broke out into a childish grin, barely containing his own excitement. I think it went really well. I feel really good about most of it. Midoriya confidently waved out a hand in dismissal. There's no way I failed. Gami cheered loudly, growing even more animated. I knew you could do it. I'm so proud of you. The teen made it to the privacy of the staircase before he let his laughs become audible, trickling down into something just a bit more serious. Thanks. And thank you again for agreeing to wait outside while I took the test. Gami settled down a bit. Of course. Eraser had asked me personally, and I respect both him and his reasoning. Still, Midoriya shrugged. There wasn't much he could do to stop you if you did. Thanks. I really appreciate it. You would not have needed my help regardless, though I may have put up more of an argument if he asked me to sit out of your test exercise. Midoriya nodded absent-mindedly. Aizawa hadn't explicitly said anything about Gami participating or not in the test exercise, but considering he specifically mentioned for the ghost to wait outside the classroom for the written test, well, Aizawa just didn't forget little things like that, and he didn't need the pro hero to admit or it to leave a smile on his face anyway. Yeah, I won't deny any extra help, that's for sure. He looked up at his mentor with a lax stare. But if the exercise is really just robots, then I think I'll be okay. Kendo, the girl from 1B, made a point of stopping by their lunch table again in the weeks leading up to today. Most of it had been to apologize for Monoma's past behavior, but she'd also given them some insider information she'd gotten from an upperclassman to truly extend the olive branch. Apparently, the final test exercise would actually just be something similar to the entrance exam, an urban setting, Lots of mock villain robots and maybe a zero-pointer giant or two. That had been a huge relief to most of Class 1A, as well as to Midoriya himself. It didn't stop him from training as hard as he could anyway, but it was a lot easier to sleep at night knowing he'd just have to disintegrate metal scrap to pass. A shit ton of it, but metal nonetheless. Plus, it was nice knowing that he didn't have to whip out his scythe anytime soon, especially with how it was making him feel these past few weeks. He just couldn't hold it in his hands the same anymore. Of course, I have the utmost confidence in you. Gami doubled down. I'll just be there to push a robot or two aside, in a moment of need. Midoriya snorted. You think you'll have the consistency for that? Gami almost seemed to falter, but the look was gone so quickly that Midoriya wasn't really sure. I've remained fairly solid for a long while. I should be all right. The ghost looked delicately at his hand, stroking his skeletal fingers with gentle care. Midoriya's brows furrowed, but he masked it with a simple twitch of his lips. We should be training you at this rate. That may not be that bad of an idea, Gami chuckled. They'd reached the locker room door, and Midoriya turned over his shoulder just before he pushed it open. We'll save it for after the Forest Lodge. The idea of actually relaxing is starting to grow on me. No one was actually inside the locker room, which wasn't much of a surprise to either of them. Despite how long he'd taken on the written exam, Midoriya was certainly quicker than most of his classmates. The only ones who made it before him were Yaoyorozu, Todoroki, Bakugo, and Ida. And considering the empty room, the boys at least, probably didn't take much time to socialize afterwards either. Midoriya entered the combination to his locker and grabbed out his costume briefcase as the door popped open. Moment of truth. He flicked open the latches, holding the case shut. Let's see. Gami peered eagerly over his shoulder as the costume came into view. I don't see the head anymore. The teen breathed out a sigh of relief. I mean, I never doubted Aizawa, but I wasn't sure if the changes would be finished by now. After multiple failed attempts to replace that flimsy hat with something better, mostly because of the other more important things interrupting him before he had the chance to bring it up, he'd finally confided in Aizawa about the whole situation. They talked pretty in-depth about everything, and Midoriya even shared some of his quick sketches as references, but with how long he'd waited to ask, he wasn't sure if even a rush order by a UA teacher would be enough for the support course to get it ready in time. Clearly he was wrong, but this time, he really didn't mind. Gami swirled ecstatically as his successor pulled out the jumpsuit piece. Come on, put it on already. Midoriya rolled his eyes but didn't bother arguing, stripping down away from the confines of the stalls. The jumpsuit itself hadn't changed much. It was a pretty basic design, all black, thick fabric, fitted just enough not to drag, but loose enough that his skin could breathe. One thing he had asked to change were the bulky knee pads the support course had added into his original design. He'd never gotten around to it before, since the extra protection was serving him well, but he'd unconsciously slipped some new ideas into his reference sketches that he ended up giving to Aizawa. Now, instead of having metal plating over top his jumpsuit, the padding was sewn into the very fabric itself. Midoriya poked at his covered kneecaps, feeling the bite of hidden plating poke him back. He slipped on his new boots, of which he also changed just a bit. Gone were any decorative features the support course insisted on, like those clock buckles on the sides, and only simplicity remained. The iron soles were made a little bit thicker. There was more protection around his toes and heels. He kept the straps, just no decorative buckles, and added some laces for good measure. With all the sharp movement he'd likely be doing in the future because of his blast, it just gave him peace of mind knowing he wouldn't lose a shoe in the process. You look kind of like a racerhead. Gami snickered playfully. I'm not done yet. Midoriya snapped back a bit more defensively than he was expecting, but otherwise pulled out his new cloak and slipped it on. The front of the cloak itself didn't look too much different. It was still relatively the same length as before, only coming down to about his waist. The same white accent still trailed around the trim, and the front still opened and closed with the same clasps. With his internship costume, the cloak was an equal length all the way around, and the jumpsuit had a pair of coattails stitched onto the back to better hide his movements. Midoriya had found the discrepancy a bit impractical and redundant, but it was definitely not on the top of his priorities. But he'd had ideas swirling in his head for ages now, and slowly but surely they all found their way into his absent-minded sketches. Because now, the cloak was a whole lot different from before. The coattails from before were now intricately combined to lengthen the back of the cloak, fluttering around just to his calves. The piece of clothing overall resembled something like a poncho, and Midoriya couldn't help but indulge a childlike excitement as he danced around and watched the ends twirl. He was more than pleased. His arms were thoroughly hidden, his back felt protected, his whole body was swaddled when he was crouched, and he couldn't say what it was about such a simple piece of fabric left him feeling so safe within it. His gaze instinctively drifted towards his mentor, and he decided to keep his comment to himself. But despite how happy he was with the changes overall, this was nothing compared to what he actually was really excited for. Midoriya brought his fingers up to his neck, and with a flick of his fingers, he popped up his new hood. It was an infinite improvement from his hat. Less distracting, less likely to fall off his head, and it would stay attached to him even if it did. The hood easily covered most of his head, obscuring his eyes and shadow. And when he pulled it over his head, his large signature collar popped up too, also covering his mouth and preventing his lips from being seen. All in all, he felt safe and hidden, protected in a hold that had surrounded him since childhood, familiar arms mimicked by cloth and fabric. So? Midoriya spun around dramatically. How do I look? Gami's gaze trained up and down, to a familiar dark, flowy fabric, to a familiar draped cover, to a familiar hideaway hood. He hadn't realized the similarities when looking at all the individual sketches, but seeing it now, all put together, surely it couldn't be just a coincidence. The teen laughed nervously at Gami's silence. I was hoping you wouldn't mind me borrowing a bit of your style, Midoriya admitted. Is it too much? No, not at all. Gami was quick to rebuttal, but he failed to hold back the choked emotion in his voice. He swallowed back the wetness in his throat. You look great. I like it a lot. I'm almost jealous. Midoriya laughed for real this time. Jealous? Oh, please, you're such a softie. He wrapped his arms around the ghost, pulling his head away to smile. But thanks. And hey, maybe it's time for you to get some hero equipment of your own. Gami hummed. That sounds nice. I think I'd like that, but for now, I kind of like being your secret weapon. It is fun. Of course you'd find this whole secret fun. Midoriya rolled his eyes, but his grin stayed as he moved for the locker room door once again. But you're not a secret weapon. You're my secret partner. He gestured towards the door with his head. Ready? He couldn't see Gami smile, but he could certainly feel it well enough in the air. The ghost perked up, even more than he already was, rushing over to his side. I always am. It's always something with you. The two of them exited the locker room, slowly making their way out to the main field. Midoriya figured there was no rush, not with so many of his classmates still taking their written final when he left, so he and Gami strolled idly, chatting softly out of habit. Was it becoming of a hero? Should he be taking this precious free time before the test exercise more seriously? Probably. But right now, he was no hero. Right now, he was just a kid relishing in the sparse moments of peace he struggled to find. Right now, he was just a kid being happy. He had to let go of Gami's hand once they left the building, forcing his heart to remember that he really wasn't a kid, not anymore. Sometimes, he wondered where he'd be today if he'd made some different choices. Would things be happier? Would the people he loved be safer? Would he even have people to love at all? He usually didn't wonder for long. Thinking like that made his head hurt. Hey, Gami interrupted sternly, tapping his skeletal hand against his successor's forehead. None of that. I know that look of yours. Enough so to tell you that whatever you are thinking about has no place in your head. Midoriya waved his hand off. Sorry. You don't need to apologize. Gami floated further towards the main field. Now, let's get out there and crush this exercise. Right. Let's go kick some ass. Oh no, you are not bringing this back again. They had to quell the pep talk and excitement once they reached the central hub of the main field. There they found Midoriya's other classmates who had finished earlier. He talked with them leisurely in conversations that had no real purpose other than to pass the time. He couldn't help but keep glancing back to Bakugo throughout all of them, but the blonde strayed far away from any attempts to chat, as well as any attempts to meet Midoriya's guilty gaze. Slowly, the rest of his class joined them on the field, one by one, until the last bunch of his peers arrived, along with a slew of pro-heroes. Gami narrowed his eyes as they all lined up. 13, Present Mike, Cement Toss, Midnight, Power Loader, Ectoplasm Snipe, Aizawa. What was going on? All right, Aizawa announced, ending the nervous chitters of 20 very skeptical students. The test exercise will begin shortly. Midoriya eyed the heroes, just as unconvinced as the rest of his class. They were just going to be fighting robots. Why did they need so much staff supervision? Obviously, you can fail this test too, so if you want to head to the Forest Lodge, then we better not see any pitiful blunders from you. The teen refocused. He couldn't lose sight of what was at stake, a real chance to relax. A confident smile immediately blossomed on his face. Even the thought alone was motivation enough. Aizawa stepped forward a bit, inching out of the line of heroes. I have no doubt you all learned what information you could at the test beforehand, so I think you already hold a vague notion of what you are to do. Kaminari and Ashido piped up excitedly. It's just like the entrance exam. We'll be kicking some robot butt. They laughed, already practicing their victory dances. I can already see the fireworks, the curry, the dare sessions. The second-hand joy alone was enough to get Midoriya excited too, but not quite enough for him to miss the way Aizawa's capture scarf kept rustling. I'm afraid not. Nezu bursted from the confines of Aizawa's scarf, squeezing his way into view amongst the carbon fiber strands. He carelessly pushed aside Aizawa's head to make room for his own, apathetically tangling one of his paws deep into the hero's hair. Aizawa looked less than happy. Midoriya and Gami had maybe just the faintest hint why. Nezu settled in his place inside Aizawa's personal space. Due to various reasons, we're changing the contents of the test, starting today. The teen blinked in disbelief, like the rest of the class. What? Principal Nezu? Yaoyorozu collected the various echoes of confusion. What do you mean? With eagerness, Nezu climbed down from Aizawa's shoulders, using his capture scarf to rappel down the underground hero like a cliffside. Even from a distance, Midoriya still searched for a hint of something more in the rodent's eyes, yet found nothing but blankness. It wasn't unusual by any means, but something about it still shook him to his core. When had he become so afraid of Nezu? Well, he started cheerfully, but it sounded so empty to Midoriya's ears. If our society continues at this current pace, we foresee a likely drastic increase in open combat against villains, of which our robotic counterparts are no longer viable comparisons in terms of accuracy or effectiveness. Midoriya frowned. He hadn't realized the sheer level of contact his class alone had with villains so far this year, from the USJ incident to that night in Hosu, hell, even the day the reporters broke through the school gate. That was no civilian feat. He'd brushed his hands with villainy far too more often than what he had presumed was normal, even for heroes in training. He'd become so desensitized to the gravity of what he'd been through, what they'd all been through, and just as the thought of death no longer seemed to bother him, the uprising of villains this year had, too, started to become eerily numb. So from now on, we'll focus our test more on person-on-person battle activities and emphasize a teaching environment closer to that of a real battle. Gami quickly glanced at his successor, and it took Midoriya a moment to figure out what he was trying to say. His face slowly dropped as his eye swept over the lineup of heroes turned teachers. Nezu eyed the growing realization amongst the students with malicious glee, a grin growing across his muzzle. Which is all to say that henceforth, we will form you into pairs to engage in combat with one of these educators. The principal gestured cheekily behind him. Midoriya clenched his hands together tight, trying to stop the slight shaking that was starting to stir up. Gami pressed a silent hand to his back. The teen took a breath. There was no point in getting all worked up just yet. Aizawa picked up for Nezu. Now, your pairings and the teacher you'll be fighting have already been decided. The underground hero pulled out a sheet of paper. First up, Kaminari's with Ashido, as a team against Nezu. Midoriya swallowed heavily as he heard his respective classmates groan in distress. He felt bad for them. Going up against Nezu was like a death sentence, but part of him was more than grateful that at least it wasn't him. The biggest fear that had flashed in his mind since the sudden announcement was laid to rest. The churning in his stomach started to quell, a shaky smile taking its place. He was confident he could handle anyone else. Next, Todoroki and Yaoyorozu, against me. He glanced back. Todoroki didn't look too concerned, but Yaoyorozu flashed a nervous look. Midoriya bit his lip. Hopefully he could chat with her before her test. She'd done so much for the class in preparation for the written exam. Maybe he could give her some pointers on Aizawa in return. Then, Aizawa continued, Midoriya and Tokiyami against... Surprise again, Nezu interrupted. Another change of plans. Midoriya's heart stopped. Gami's soul froze over. Aizawa snapped his head so fast they could almost hear the sound. Nezu, what? As principal, I made the executive decision to change some of the things that was decided before. The rodent continued without so much as a care in the world, oblivious to the absolute rage in Aizawa's eyes. Tokiyami will now be paired with Asui against ectoplasm. Seeing the path to complete and utter ruin they were treading down, Yamada tried to step forward, but he was not fast enough to beat Aizawa. We had already... Not to worry, Aizawa-san. I left the other pairings unchanged. Nezu smiled directly at Midoriya in a way that left his hand shaking, his heart hammering, his breath lodged in his throat. That leaves Midoriya with Bakugo. It was almost as if, in that very moment, the sun itself stopped, leaving the earth to freeze over in a callously ravenous chill. His blood, his breath, his very heart, everything stopped in that moment, as his eyes drifted towards Bakugo in total shock. and for the first time in years, he found Bakugo looking back at him with something other than hate, even if it was just a moment. If this was even close to what death truly felt like, Midoriya would get on his knees and thank every god out there that a pathetic being like him was immortal. Nezu took advantage of the disturbance he knew he caused. I'm also moving them to fight directly after my exercise, as well as changing who they will be paired against. A large, hulking figure emerged from behind the crowd of teachers. I hope I'm not late. Oh no. But I'm here. He had to be asleep, dreaming. All Might stepped into the plaza. Midoriya pinched himself. He was painfully awake. What the hell had Nezu done? Gami had never been so silent in his life. The air had never been so agonizingly cold. None of the teachers knew what to say. None of the teachers knew what to do, not even as Aizawa took a threatening step towards the principal once he'd snapped out of a state of shock. Nezu. None of the teachers knew what to think when Yamada followed him. The voice hero knew he could do nothing as the world around him began to crash and burn, but he found it in himself to try regardless. This isn't what we agreed on as... The rodent gave a hearty chuckle, that heartlessly adamant grin still plastered on his face. Things don't always go according to plan. Now do they? Midoriya couldn't find it within himself to do anything more than continue pushing air in and out of his lungs. The world around him spun, rocking back and forth like stormy sea waves. And even from his precarious place seated atop a metal bleacher inside the school's observation room, it would barely take a gust of wind to send him plunging below the surface yet again. Another sudden headache threatened to overtake him, pounding from the insides of his skull. His rocky world seemed to blend together, mixing colors and senses until, for just a moment, Midoriya wasn't sure if he was in his world anymore. But just as quickly as it came, the feeling danced out of reach, leaving him dazed as he plummeted back down to rock bottom. It was just the stress, he told himself. He was just stressed. He pressed his eyes shut, desperately trying to get the echoes of yelling out of his ears. Aizawa had been furious, absolutely furious, in this low, simmering rage that scared the teen much more than any outburst could have. Aizawa hadn't cared about bringing up any of his numerous concerns in front of both the students and his fellow teachers, and surprisingly, Yamada had stood by him and his reasons. But Nezu was sneaky. He always had been. So despite all the fair points Aizawa made amongst his fury, the rat slithered away, hiding behind his title, his power, and All Might, who had truly no idea what tempest he'd been brought into. Like a coward, he ran. He ran to start his test exercise against Kaminari and Ashido, who were now probably even more unnerved than before, and left the hurricane that now was Aizawa to the rest of the teachers to deal with. The teen stifled a flinch as he heard another one of Aizawa's sharp bites through the door, followed by a cacophony of damage control with a pinch of soft yet strong Yamada intricately woven in. Midoriya picked his head out of his hands, trying to cut his sulking off while he still could. The inside of the observation room didn't look much better than the outside sounded. All Might was the hero. The rest had designated to watch over the students while they all tried to resolve the mess Nezu had left in his wake. And despite the easygoing bravado he wore, the way he nervously paced around the room said otherwise. His class wasn't faring much better. The tenseness hung in the air like a thick mist, and he glanced around the room. Most of his peers glanced away from him. Midoriya tried not to feel hurt. He knew he was awkwardly stuck in the center of this mess since it was his new pairing causing the divide, but his heart still ached all the same. He didn't want anyone to feel uncomfortable because of him, and he didn't want to be the reason one of his peers did poorly on this important end-of-term exercise. He stood up from his seat and tried not to think about how everyone's eyes were inevitably on him. He walked up to All Might, who almost seemed to freeze, keeping his voice at a whisper. All Might-sensei, could I wait at the bus like Bakugo? Bakugo had practically dismissed himself earlier, refusing to spend his time amongst the class in the observation room, refusing to engage in whatever pitiful politics Aizawa and the other teachers were currently hashing out. He'd been directed to the bus that would take him and Midoriya out to the urban city for their exercise and promptly been forgotten. Midoriya didn't want to run into Bakugo, especially not after all this, when he'd be volatile beyond belief, but he had the feeling he was better off leaving everyone else without the suffocation of his presence. And despite his somehow prevailing logic trying to tell him watching Kaminari and Ashido's fight on one of the numerous display monitors in the room would be beneficial for his upcoming exercise, he couldn't bring himself to meet eyes with Nezu's figure and not feel utterly sick. Of course, young Midoriya. All Might pointed at the door, wincing when Yamada's bark almost conveniently seemed to answer him. Just go back out the way we came. Our bus is the third from the end. I'll meet you both out there once it's time to go. There was no air of uncertainty in his voice, and solemnly, Midoriya found himself agreeing. Nezu had changed things, and once he did that, there was no changing them back. Midoriya appreciated the fight Aizawa and Yamada had put up. He really did. There really wasn't a point anymore. He thanked him, walking up to the exit door, his steps slowing as the collection of voices outside grew louder. He swallowed thickly, bracing himself for what was to come as he gently pushed the door open. If there was any silver lining about the persistent arguing, at least it kept them all occupied intensely enough for him to slip by without incident. Little listener. Something up there hated Midoriya more than he could ever hate himself. He froze, but only for a moment as all the constant arguing from before suddenly died down into limp whispers. He couldn't look back at them, and when his heart jump-started back up again, he pressed his eyes shut tightly, one last-ditched attempt to hold himself together. And like a coward, he ran. Once he finally found himself alone, he pittered to a stop. He rubbed aggressively at his eyes, digging his palms into his skull. He wasn't going to cry. Damn it, he wasn't. He was so goddamn tired of crying. He was so goddamn tired of everything going out of its way to make him miserable, and he was even more tired of constantly giving into it. He was so fucking tired of feeling this pathetic. The tears gathering in the corners of his eyes boiled away in the heat of his newfound anger. Midoriya took a few quick breaths, forcing his eyes open, and finding himself more alone than he expected. Gami. He looked around, anger immediately dissolving into worry. A few painfully silent seconds passed before the ghost slowly emerged from inside the wall beside him. Midoriya's brows knitted when Gami still didn't respond. Hey. Taking advantage of life, how dare he? Soft mumblings only answered, escaping like the last drain of a sink. Gifted with thought, he abuses it. This world is crowded. A waste of space, even as a dust. The teen couldn't listen anymore. Gami, stop! The mumbling stopped, replaced by an almost confused clarity. I don't. What? Just stop, please. I don't need this right now. What did I? He stopped. I'm sorry. The guilt in his mentor's voice felt familiar somehow, and Midoriya caved. Look, you're angry, I know. I'm angry too, but Nezu doesn't give a shit if we're angry. He stopped, calming himself back down. Nezu doesn't care how we feel. He's just going to keep doing whatever he wants anyway. I'm tired of giving him that satisfaction of knowing that we're angry, knowing that we can't do anything about it. But none of this is fair. I know, but I'm done being angry. It's not doing anything. Midoriya then looked up firmly, some cocktail of spite and determination in his eyes. So instead, we're going to go in there, we're going to crush this final exam, and we're going to get that break that we both earned, and nothing is going to take it away. I agree, but maybe it won't come to that. Gami desperately tried to insist. Eraserhead can still fix this and change things to how they were before. His successor looked at him skeptically, and Gami sighed. All right, the ghost nodded. What do you want me to do? All Might tried to get either student to chat on their bus ride to the urban city field, but Bakugo sat in the very back with no intent to talk, and Midoriya remained steeled on the window in deep, unbreakable focus. And despite his efforts to lighten the mood, the silence was there to stay, at least until the bus pulled to a stop at the end of the road. Midoriya stepped off first, Gami closely behind, and he left ample room for Bakugo to get off and stand idly without having to be too close to one another. Still, as the other boy got off the bus and stood in line with him, Midoriya couldn't resist the temptation to glance at him anyway, searching for something more, something reminiscent of those faint childhood memories his heart still foolishly clung on to. Bakugo scowled at him, jerking his head to the side. He couldn't find it within him to feel anything but overwhelming guilt. Midoriya instead turned his gaze in front of him, losing some of his immediate guilt but keeping his overwhelm at the immense scale of the massive city before them. It looked like the city right outside of UA. If someone had told him that was what this truly was, he would have believed them without so much of a second thought. Still, despite his awe, his natural paranoia couldn't help but catch the ominously placed camera right above the entry gate. He wondered who exactly looked back at him as he stared into the lens. He wondered who it was. His classmates back in the observation room saw as they looked at him from nothing but a screen. What did they see when they saw him? Was it someone worth all the trouble he'd brought with him since he'd stepped foot into UA? A bony finger knocked him in the forehead again. None of that. All right, to start. All Might began, standing before the iron gate. You have a time limit of 30 minutes. Midoriya hummed. That's about as long as it had been between Kaminari and Ashido's exam had began and now. He frowned a bit, If they use all 30 minutes then, against Nezu, he really shouldn't be surprised. Your win condition for this exercise is either to pin these handcuffs on me. Hero then pulled out a pair of bulky yellow handcuffs that looked to resemble quirk cancellation gear. Or alternatively, for either of you to escape from this field. All Might then threw the handcuffs forward, and when Bakugo didn't even bother to reach for them, Midoriya caught them midair instead. He examined them in his hands. They were heavier than he expected, and their size looked much too small to even consider them capable of restraining All Might's thick wrists. Midoriya looked up at the teacher. It's okay to run. Yep, All Might flashed a smile. This will be a test of your judgment. Midoriya looked subtly off to the side, where he could just make out the wisps of Gami's robes and his peripherals. That changed some things. However, you might think that with this current setup, running is your only real option. Number 1 hero shook his head, and somehow the action stuttered disappointment in Midoriya's heart, but All Might immediately captured his focus yet again, as he pulled out a set of restraints from behind him. The staff and I commissioned the support course to make me super compressor weights. The hero then strapped multiple onto his wrists and ankles, and Midoriya watched his muscles tremble, though he really had to search for it. I've now strapped on weights equal to half my body weight. It's an old classic, but it'll make it harder for me to move or save strength. Is all that just to let us consider fighting? Bakugo spoke for the first time practically since the class had all gathered at the center field, and despite whatever foolishness Midoriya had been hoping for, his voice still dripped all the same venom. You're looking down on me. Me, he'd said. Not us. Me. Midoriya took a deep breath and tried to hold it all together. All Might just laughed. Just remember, I have every intention of seriously going after you two. The hero then pressed a button on the side of the gate, and they all watched as the entryway opened with an intimidating groan. Good luck. True to his words, All Might gave them a thumbs up. Your test begins now. And with that, he leapt from the ground with ease, soaring off into the city field, far past either their lines of sight. Bakugo immediately stormed off into the area without so much as a word. Don't follow me. Okay, maybe a word, or 3. Midoriya scampered inside, at least until he was out of sight from that first camera, before turning to Gami. Change of plans. We don't engage him unless we have to. He glanced back at the blonde, who was quickly disappearing from his sight. Shit, let me go get Bakugo. Why? What is the point? Gami cut himself off as his successor ran forward. Midoriya swallowed thickly. Bakugo! The name felt alien on his tongue, and his chest shuddered at having to force it out. Maybe we should... I don't want any of your pitiful attempts at helping. Bakugo looked over his shoulder, back at him, a snarl encompassing his features darkened by malice and hate. It's fucking obvious I should just knock him out. Midoriya repeated his mantra in his head. This wasn't really Bakugo. This wasn't Bakugo's fault. This was just some warped, twisted version of a 4-year-old child his brain couldn't even remember anymore. All at his own hands. This was all his own fault. He'd let it grow and fester. He'd let it corrupt Bakugo beyond recognition, to the point where Midoriya truly believed nothing was unusual with how the years transpired. If there was anyone to despair at, it was himself, and his own numerous failures. If anything, he at least owed Bakugo some persistence and cooperation, even if he wanted absolutely nothing to do with him anymore. Please, Izuku, maybe realize this isn't worth... We really shouldn't engage. He cursed his hesitance and subsequent stutter, forcing himself to push forward, both his words and his steps. At least, not right away. But either Bakugo didn't hear him or didn't care. I'll lead him around by the nose like a fool up until the final moments, and then I'll fucking smash his head in whenever he's tuckered out. Just me. Stop interfering. I want nothing to do with you. Midoriya grimaced, grinding his teeth together, blood splattering in front of his eyes. He couldn't do this again. He'd just gotten through this last near disaster, barely. He'd watched Ida throw himself down into despair, throw himself at the feet of the hero killer, waiting to be slaughtered. He'd seen what his curse was capable of, twisting those he loved to throw themselves at death, to throw themselves away from him. And while he knew All Might wasn't fighting to the death, and while he thought he knew at least, that no one had the eyes of death upon them today, he couldn't watch what was inarguably his own fault tear apart the lives of anyone else. You're just going to charge right in, head first. He tried to appeal to reason. This is All Might we're talking about. But reason meant nothing to the cursed. Fuck off. Aizawa tapped his foot anxiously against the tiled floor, helplessly watching as Midoriya continued to try and fail to convince Bakugo to cooperate. Yamada stood supportively at his side, hands nearly brushing together as they, along with the rest of the staff and most of the students, watched the monitors resolutely, waiting for that other shoe to finally drop. His heart ached in a way unfamiliar to him, heightened by a loss and longing he'd tried so hard to never feel again. He was attached. He was painfully attached in a way he knew was far too risky for his line of work. The door to the observation room squealed and Nezu carelessly strolled inside. A bright smile plastered on his face. The other shoe dropped. Aizawa felt long fingers wrap gently around his wrist, a delicate message straight to his brain that stopped him in his tracks, before he even realized he was storming towards Nezu at all. The rodent chuckled, casually moving to stand directly beside the underground hero. "Quite the reception from you all." He focused his beady eyes on the monitor screens along with everyone else. "Unfortunately, Kaminari and Ashido will not be joining us. Recovery Girl insisted that they stay with her so she could monitor them." Aizawa narrowed his eyes. He hadn't gotten to see most of the match since he'd spent the time outside with the rest of the staff, but from what he did see, Nezu had absolutely decimated them. And even with Nezu's history of general apathy, tendency for sadism, and newfound disregard for Midoriya's well-being, even Aizawa was unprepared for how viciously the rodent toyed with his students for half an hour straight. His eyes flickered back to the screen, watching Midoriya say something else to Bakugo's back. The monitors had no audio. Yamada had figured the speakers would likely blow out if he had incorporated audio in. But even still, he could hear the desperation swirling in the air, through the blue light of the screen. "Surely, you can't think this is beneficial to either of them in any way." The words slipped past Aizawa's lips in a smooth, methodical resentment, so opposite to his previously exploding anger. "We agreed that we'd approach this with more delicacy." They talked about their options if Bakugo was indeed cursed by Midoriya's strange abilities. The situation wasn't one they had any precedent in dealing with, and by the way it was beginning to evolve, more and more of his students were being put at risk. Neither really knew how to help Bakugo, despite Midoriya's cryptic advice of appealing to an unrelated hate. So instead, they figured to do as much damage control as possible until one of them had a solid game plan. That was why Bakugo was paired with Asawi. She was incredibly well-rounded and wouldn't be overly hindered by his inability to cooperate effectively, as well as her uncanny ability to provide substantial combat support to practically every student in this class. Midoriya wasn't supposed to even interact with Bakugo during this exercise. That was the plan. Yamada glanced around, at the nervous looks of his fellow teachers, at the nervous looks of his students, at the firm stare in Aizawa's eyes, before deciding that this, too, would be the hill he would die on. "We already made a decision for Midoriya's pairing as a group. It was the most educated decision possible. All the staff agreed on it." Nezu shrugged, still staring intently at the screen, watching the slow crumbling of a disaster. "I felt the need to change it." Fury again began to bubble in Aizawa's stomach. "Then why didn't you tell us beforehand, so we could—" "I suggest you step back from this, Aizawa-san." His voice held a stiff, punctual air, and he wielded it unforgivingly. "You're a bit too involved." Aizawa almost sputtered in shock, a sound he never thought would come from his mouth since becoming a hero, and he bit his teeth together to hold it in. How dare he? How dare he? He was the one who entrusted Midoriya to him in the first place. Hell, Nezu had sprung at the child on him in one of his apathetic, narcissistic self-decisions. He'd never even consulted him or Yamada about their feelings on having guardianship of a child they'd only known for weeks at that point. He was too involved. He was too involved? That was Nezu's own fucking fault in the first place. And despite that, despite all of Nezu's meddling, as if his own staff and students were his personal lab rats, they loved Midoriya. He didn't even need to consult Yamada. They both loved him with all they had. Nezu better be ready for him to be involved, because he'd already failed the boy more than was forgivable, and he'd already let this drag on far longer than what was acceptable. The venom behind his teeth began to leak, but a sudden move from one of the monitors brought them all back. Gami desperately tried to catch up to his successor, the boy getting too close to Bakugo for his own comfort. He didn't trust this. He didn't trust anyone but the boy he'd grown up next to for the past 11 years. Everyone was out to hurt him. Nowhere was safe but the security of the space within his arms. Gami needed to protect him, and he didn't know how else. "Wait, please!" Midoriya reached out, reaching for a life he'd lost, reaching for a life he hadn't realized he could ever have again, reaching for a past his heart silently begged to taste again, reaching for this one last shot at forgiveness for them both. I think my powers are cursing people." "Izuku." "Bakugo is still being affected by it. He has been since that day." "Please, we don't need to fight anymore. We can do this together." He never had a chance. Midoriya reeled away as Bakugo's arm swung at his face, nailing him savagely in the side of the face with one of his gauntlets. Midoriya collapsed in the middle of the road, crumbling to pieces as he clutched the side of his head. Gami screamed. Some of the cameras buzzed up. Some of the street lights popped. Nobody noticed among the chaos. Midoriya quickly looked back up, ignoring the blood running from his now split lip, ignoring the way his brain protested the sudden movement. His eyes locked onto how Bakugo stood above him, how Bakugo had complete control over him, how the gap between them was far larger than he ever would have imagined. His eyes locked onto the other shock that shimmered in Bakugo's gaze, watching as he looked down at his own hand almost in confusion, before a disgusting hatred clouded his vision. "Not another goddamn word. Don't you say another word or I'll fucking kill you." The threat was so real, and so fake at the same time. "I fucking told you." Bakugo took a step towards him, and Midoriya scrambled to get up, to get away, to do anything useful as he was faced with the faults of his fears. "I don't need any help from you." Midoriya didn't respond. He couldn't. None of the thoughts swirling in his head had enough substance to manifest as words. All his mind could do was replay that helpless look he caught in Bakugo's eyes for just that second. That was his fault. All of this was his fault. How had he let this get so bad? How had he failed Bakugo like this? How had they failed each other like this? His face ached and throbbed, and he tasted blood on his lips as it dribbled down the same way his tears desperately begged to. He was going to fix this. He was going to try. Aizawa gripped the edge of the table in front of him, his knuckles turning white and his teeth grinded together. His vision went red seeing Midoriya go down, and a strong protectiveness surged within him. Yamada tried to keep both parties at bay, but in his one moment of distraction trying to fix the fuzzy cameras, the two went at it like feral dogs. "Enough, Aizawa-san," Nezu snapped at him with threatening emptiness. "You're starting to make a scene." Aizawa nearly lunged, but Yamada stepped between the two, trying to give his partner time to calm down a bit. "Nezu, we decided the pairings as a group for a reason. Your making this change on your own could compromise both Midoriya and Bakugo's ability to pass the exam." Nezu almost seemed to consider his reasoning for a moment before shaking his head, still with an arrogant smile. "Good heroes should be able to work with anyone at a moment's notice. We don't get to choose our partners on the field." That was enough for Aizawa to finally push past Yamada. "Damn it, Nezu, they're not heroes, they're kids. There's a time and place for things." He stepped forward, standing up right next to Nezu, who didn't seem fazed at all. The air in the room settled back into tension again as staff and students alike precariously watched another disaster begin to unfold. Yamada moved to try and pull the two off each other, but he jumped back as Aizawa swung an arm out to gesture at the numerous monitors before them all. "Look at this, Nezu." He pointed at the screen which held Midoriya's prone figure, still trying to recover from the brutal blow dealt to him by his own classmate. Bakugo still screaming at him. "Is this it?" There wasn't a chance for a response as a massive billow of dust and smoke erupted across that monitor, as well as the ones capturing the area around there. A shockwave rampaged down the street, blowing apart buildings and breaking apart the asphalt that both Bakugo and Midoriya stood on. Any chance Midoriya had to rise to his feet again was crushed, as he was knocked back, losing Bakugo in the mess. Midoriya's head rocked back again from the whiplash and almost cracked against the road, if not for Gami's timely catch as he swooped in to save him from more injuries. "Izuku," Gami speedily checked him over. "Are you all right?" He recovered from all the sudden movement, panting as he caught his breath. Yeah, I'm good." With his first priority covered, Gami moved on to his next one. "We need to leave. You said we should not engage, and he is coming, so we need to leave." Midoriya looked at Bakugo way in front of him, who hadn't been knocked back by the blast as far as he had. "We can't just—" "Collateral damage to the city? Who gives a fuck?" A figure emerged from the smoke. "If you're thinking of this as just a test, then you're in for a world of pain." All Might's face became clear, and his signature smile that had carried Midoriya through some of his darker times in childhood was warped beyond recognition. "I am a villain, O heroes." All Might lowered his head as his body folded into a running stance. "Come at me, and put your whole hearts into it." And All Might charged. All right, listeners, this concludes Chapter 46 of Deku and Death. Chapter 47 will be up next. I hope you all are still enjoying this fic. Let me know your thoughts and reactions to this chapter, and as always, thank you so much for listening.